Hello everyone, welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Himbar, and today I have a very exciting video for you. I find it very exciting. I just finished reading an essay in this collection called Exploring Fantasy Worlds, essays on fantastic literature by a host of authors. It's edited by Daryl Schweitzer. I believe it came out in the 80s. Some of this content is older than that, of course. So I read the first essay, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. That is Aspects of Fantasy by Michael Moorcock, which is actually a collection of 4 shorter essays, kind of a series from the Science Fantasy magazine, and the series was ended in 1964. I think all 4 came out in 1964. Science Fantasy got sold to a different publisher, and it was just a few years later that the whole thing was shut down after being renamed and stuff. So, Michael Moorcock, I think, would shortly go on to be the main editor, I believe, actually, for the sister magazine, New Worlds. But it's pretty interesting because 1964, Michael Moorcock was 24 when he wrote these, which is crazy to me. I wish I could write stuff like this and publish it in a magazine. That's younger than I am now. But I really enjoyed this one, actually. It's better in my mind than Epic Pooh. Epic Pooh is an essay I recently talked about, written by Michael Moorcock. That came out in 1978, so 14 years after this. And that one is more about the style of writing fantasy. It's famously harsh on Tolkien, and then as well as, like Terry Goodkind and Terry Brooks. And it's a great essay. You should go read that one. But this one's pretty fun, honestly. So I just want to go over it because this might be a little longer as far as essay videos go. Wait until the end, or maybe skip ahead to the 4th part, though, because if you find these first 3 parts boring, Moorcock gets fired up in the last one, and it's pretty intense, and it's kind of funny. This again was put in this book like 2 decades after he'd originally written these, so he does say in the introduction, there's a quote saying, like, I might not exactly have these same thoughts, and I'll probably share that quote later when I get to the more controversial stuff in part 4. But part 1 is just an introduction. And so it starts with, what is fantasy fiction? It is, of course, a broad field, but on the other hand, fairly easy to define. It is fiction which deals into fantastic and what is outside of ordinary human experience. It contains many subgenres, of which science fiction is one. It is written on many levels by writers of varying ability who use it for a great number of purposes. Today, it ranges from the ill-written ghoul operas published in poor quality paperbacks to the well-written extravaganzas of Peake, Tolkien, and others. His opinion of Tolkien's actually kind of contradictory in this essay, so we'll get to that later, though. But then he poses this, it says, a more interesting question, and one which I hope partially to answer in these articles, is why is fantasy? Why is it written? Why is it read? What is its appeal? We kind of talked about this in one of the previous essays I looked at, called Why Sword and Sorcery by Brian Murphy. This is a little bit more broader, definitely a lot longer. The essay itself is 20-something pages, about twice the length of Why Sword and Sorcery, if I'm remembering correctly. So he quotes actually Lovecraft. So this is pretty important. He says, this is a quote from Lovecraft, modern science has, in the end, proved an enemy to art and pleasure, for by revealing to us the whole sordid and prosaic basis of our thoughts, motives, and acts, it has stripped the world of glamour, wonder, and all those illusions of heroism, mobility, and sacrifice, which used to sound so impressive when romantically treated. Indeed, it is not too much to say that psychological discovery and chemical, physical, and psychological research have largely destroyed the element of emotion among informed and sophisticated people by resolving it into its component parts. Moorcock goes on and says he disagrees. He says this quote is better. This is by J.G. Ballard. I feel that the writer of fantasy has a marked tendency to select images and ideas which directly reflect the internal landscape of his mind, and the reader of fantasy must interpret them on this level, distinguishing between the manifest content, which may seem obscure, meaningless, and nightmarish, and the latent content, the private vocabulary, symbols drawn by the narrative form, or from the writer's mind, the dream world, synthetic landscapes, and plasticity of visual forms invented by the writer of fantasy are external equivalents of the inner world of the psyche. He even says Lovecraft would actually probably agree with Ballard if Lovecraft had been writing at the time a Ballard. But then this is very important with he's going to go on later to really hate on science fiction, essentially. But he's also going to explain where we get this inner psyche stuff and where it really first appears from writers. But he has to establish a lot of other stuff first. So he's doing a really good job, having read the whole essay, kind of starting it out. Let's see. He says there's sometimes a growing interest and sometimes a wane in fantasy. He says the increasing interest in the fantasy form seems to show that intelligent people are indeed looking beyond its purely sensational and romantic aspects and finding it rewarding literary field. Those critics who still decry it for its usual lack of deep characterization do not see that it is completely reversed the real world of the social novel, placing its heroes in a landscape directly reflecting the inner landscape of the ordinary man. The hero ranges the lands of his own psyche, encountering the various aspects of himself. When we read a good fantasy, we are being admitted into the subterranean worlds of our own souls. And that, honestly, is one of the best explanations of why you shouldn't spurn fantasy like I've ever heard, because even today you'll still have people that turn their noses up at the idea of fantasy fiction, and I think Moorcock basically stuck it to him there. Anyways, so then we have stuff he kind of talks about the difference between fantasy and fairy stories. Part of the purpose of the child's fairy story is to describe the horror and then by means of an easily identifiable hero destroy it, thus laying the ghost. The child is full of fears and fancies. Therefore, one of the differences between fairy stories and the major proportion of adult fantasy stories is that an adult story rarely produces a comforting end. That's an interesting kind of opposite on fairy stories. I can't remember when On Fairy Stories got published, but I'm pretty sure it was written well before this. And I don't know if he had read it, but it kind of seems like a pushback on that. Anyways, because in On Fairy Stories by Tolkien, which I also reviewed, I think it was the first one I reviewed in this series, Tolkien says fairy stories, which he's basically conflating with fantasy, should have good endings. They shouldn't be tragedies. Moorcock goes kind of in an opposite direction, where eventually this is going to lead to us talking about tragic heroes. And so he talks about a lot of stuff. He says we're familiar with, well, he basically says we've always had fantasy stories, right? They've always existed. They are the oldest form of story, essentially, right? And so then he says we're familiar with the Greek legends, English folk tales, the stories of King Arthur and his Round Table. And then he says they certain archetypal characters, situations, these classical situations, they recur constantly, and they recur in chivalric and gothic romances, in Goethe, Wagner, and the Jacobean tragedists, the works of Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, Bierce, Dunsany, Blackwood, Machen, through the first half of the 20th century with James Branch Cabell, E.F. Benson, Charles Williams, Lovecraft, Howard, and the Weird Tales School, to Bloch, Leiber, Bradbury, and others in the U.S., and Peake and Tolkien, Powers, etc. in this country. And apart from complexities of plot and more sophisticated means of storytelling and the odd change of scenery, the basic form has not changed since Cervantes took the Mickey out and Don Quixote, to say it like a Brit. It is romantic, it is sensational, and it is, and at its best, illuminating. And then he lists, I would say, 3 types of writers in this case. He lists more, which I'll go on to the next page. There are that go directly to the source inspiration and write within its context. He lists 2 people here I've never even heard of. Thomas Burnett Swan and Treese. I should have looked them up before. I didn't. Sorry. And he says, remove the whole machinery to the imaginary setting, which mentions merits. Howard, Leiber, Tolkien. And then he says, others who specialize in contemporary setting, contrasting the prosaic with the supernatural to produce their effects. He says this has been lost since the days of the Edwardian school. There's also, though, kind of stories that are intended to horrify. These next 2 seem a little different than the previous 3, but He says the kind of typical stuff of weird tales, and then the kind of stuff which seeks to entertain the reader on a wider canvas, so Lost Race or sword and sorcery stories. This would have been like right after, I think, Leiber coined the term sword and sorcery, if I'm remembering correctly, my timeline correctly. Let's say, he says, other writers go further. They make use of symbols, archetypes, and narrative machinery in their fantasy story and attempt to weave them into a structure which, in its implications, causes the readers to sense more deeply the nature of his existence. And he gives a couple examples. One of them being, well, the one you might recognize more is Lewis's, he calls it the Paralandra trilogy, but that would be a space or cosmic trilogy, which I recently finished, actually. And then there's one thing, skipping a little bit, he says, as Lovecraft shows, there is need for the writer to be aware of his real sources, though as Ballard's work illustrates, it can be greatly improved if he is, there is no need for the writer to be aware of his real sources. I think this one would, I think this, I've seen people point out that this is the problem with a lot of modern fantasy being 90s and on, or maybe mid 80s or whatever, that it is not aware of its sources. Essentially, it's more of like their inspiration is Tolkien and not Tolkien's inspirations, and then that hurts the work. It works, but it doesn't work as well as taking it from these these actual sources. And I think actually some people would actually agree with that. And I'm kind of in that camp. I actually kind of agree with that. So we'll see how that goes. But anyways, he mentions then the type of fantasy storytellers before he works up to the novelist. And so he mentions people who told things that had mighty deeds and supernatural horrors. Beowulf, of course, these were in verse. He also mentions later we have chivalric romances, and he mentions the three typical ones: King Arthur, so Arthurian stuff, Charlemagnean, and Peninsular. And so, of course, the Arthurian stuff deals with Lancelot, Galahad, Arthur, obviously, Charlemagne, Roland, Oliver, Charlemagne, obviously. And then he says the Peninsular romances are, they're not as quite complex as the other two, but they're based on the character of El Cid. Should have looked up how to say that. I've heard it said before and I can't remember. The legendary champion of Spain who drove the Muslim invaders from his homeland. Okay, it is from these peninsular stories, though, that we get these decadent romances. It is where we find our first real examples of the fantasy story as opposed to the folk legend. For from about the 14th century on, the Romance chronicler ceased hanging his stories on to already existing heroes and began to invent new ones. Let's see. It says, whereas original chivalric romances were a mixture of ancient pagan legend, later Christian revision, and history and myth, the decadent romances, through borrowing heavily from the original body, were of definite authorship. They were, in fact, the first novels. He mentions some: the Palmerin of England, Tirante, the Whites, Felix Mart of Hyrcania, the Mirror of Chivalry. I've never heard of any of these, sadly. He says it was these romances that were Cervantes satirized in Don Quixote, and rejecting the romance form, laid the foundation for the modern novel and his pastoral and picaresque stories. And then it says, basically, after Cervantes stuff, it says, it kind of debunks the form, and then fantasy kind of goes out of style. It says it gave way to the novel of the country life and the colorful novel of thieves and vagabonds. Though in drama and poetry, we still find evidence of its appeal, like the Fairy Queen, for example. Said for over 100 years, the age of reason reigned. The prose romance was unpopular with intellectual and general public alike, and it took an aesthetic and antiquarian politician, Sir Horace Walpole, to instigate the return of the romance in Britain with what is generally thought to be the first real Gothic novel. One I haven't heard of, but it is very important, is The Castle of Otranto. He'll mention other Gothic novels, and he actually ends with a quote from, who's the quote? Oh, Young. And this is a part of the quote I like. It's, in a vision of other worlds, of the obscuration of the spirits, or the beginning of things before the age of man, or of the unborn generations of the future. So that's kind of like the idea of Gothic. That's part of it. It's a huge quote. I don't want to list the whole thing. And so then he goes on to this really weird part, actually, the part 2, the floodgates of unconscious. And he basically talks about these weird psychological experiences he's had that you would normally get from being on drugs. And he says, I'm not on drugs. I've never done these drugs. And they're very interesting. And he's saying, what is his drug? Gothic novels. Gothic novels have given him these weird experiences. It's really weird reading this first part of part 2, honestly. So I'm going to skip it. But that's essentially what he's saying. He says one of the best Gothic novels, like what kind of established the school of good Gothic stuff, is From the Mysteries of Udolpho by, what's her first name? Mrs. Radcliffe? Probably blanking on her name right now. But basically, it's from this that you get neurosis, like this type of like psychological stuff, right? That is important going forward, essentially, that he talked about earlier, right? Like it's in fantasy, you're getting the problems. It's not in the real world, but it's in the world of the head, right? Essentially, so it's like they see it as these things are seen as a gigantic symbol of anxiety, the dread of oppression, and of the abyss, and it is a response to the insecurity of disturbed times. That is a quote from Sir Herbert. I'm not really sure who that is again. But that's interesting because actually it reminds me a lot of why Sword and Sorcery, which is important for turbulent times, something Brian Murphy said. And he says, and then Moorcock uses that. He says, perhaps the current revival of interest in the tale of terror is also a response to the insecurity of disturbed times. And he says, basically the best person in the direct tradition of Radcliffe is Edgar Allan Poe. We get a lot of stuff from Poe after this. And he says it was Anne, that's her name, Anne Radcliffe, who taught later writers how to use natural scenery and effects to mirror the mood of their characters. And he gives examples from The Imp of the Perverse, and then he goes on and he talks a little bit about Lovecraft as well. He gives an example from The Haunter of the Dark. And then we get to part 3. He starts with a little excerpt from Christopher Marlowe's play on Faust, actually, and this is Figures of Faust, which is very interesting. He starts with, he says, even though there's older stuff, basically we're going to start with Christopher Marlowe's Faust character in this play, and that Faustus is the guy. It says right here, basically the story is of a brilliant doctor, John Faustus, who is a dabbler in alchemy and magic. He contacts Mephistopheles, the devil's agent, who tempts him to sell his soul. Friends and good angels urge him to desist, but he finally gives in on the following conditions. And I won't read those conditions, but essentially he sells his soul because, he's finally convinced, right? Turns out it's a bad idea, of course. It was probably the influences of Goethe's more complex Faust and Milton's Satan of Paradise Lost, that everyone knows. Anyways, that these things would have influenced the Gothic novel a lot, essentially. And then he talks about more Faust figures. One important one is Frankenstein from Frankenstein. He says, in Frankenstein, we see the early development, also from this, though, we see the early development of one of fantasy fiction's largest subgenres, science fiction. Dabbling in magic is replaced by dabbling in science, but the basic theme and result is the same. Here is the first anti-science science fiction tale in which the elements of fantasy blend with an interest in scientific theory to create a theme which is today commonplace in science fiction, particularly in English science fiction in the hands of Wyndham, Ballard, Aldous, and Brunner. Excuse me. And then he says the last great Gothic hero villain, and Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, which is a pretty interesting one. It's the guy who sold his soul and he's trying to get someone else to sell their soul so he can kind of get out of his bad deal. And he actually kind of criticizes this novel heavily and says it didn't get a lot of attention when it was published, but later on it did. And he says Maturin combines the myths of Faust and the Wandering Jew with all the horrible episodes of the Gothic romances, and yet he never depends on blood and gore for his effects. which I think is an important difference between a lot of modern horror. And then he says, this is a different thing. He says, throughout this long book, Melmoth can also be seen as the eyeless, faceless man, sorry, I'm reading ahead, of our dreams, and the unknown aspect of ourselves, which is symbolized as well in the figure of the cowled monk. He mentions Liber's Shield of the Eyeless Face from Popular Grey Master stories, Odin in Paul Anderson's Broken Sword, even Bester's Burning Man and Tiger. And then, let's see. It says there's a link to perhaps between the unknown aspect and the evil aspect of ourselves, in that we sense the presence of the unknown aspect and fear it, therefore judging it evil. Robert Louis Stevenson might have experienced such a process in his Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was inspired by fever dreams and nightmares during a bad illness. He produced a new variant on the Faust character as Jekyll slowly becomes dominated by Hyde. Something else along those lines is in Dorian Gray. And then he talks about the doomed hero bound to destroy himself and those he loves is one of the oldest character types in literature. And then he mentions Steerpike from Titus Groan trilogy is what he calls here. I think most people call it Gormenghast today. Paul Anderson's Scaflock and the Broken Sword, again, just mentioned in the previous page. T.H. White's Lancelot and the Once Future King. And Elric and his own stuff. So, and then he talks about vampires for a minute here, mentioning Dracula, and some earlier vampire-like type stuff, like Goethe's Braut von Corinth, maybe? I don't really know. Anyways, and then he mentions Polidori's vampire, and yada yada yada. There's other ones mentioned. Yeah, lots of stuff, lots of good Faustian stuff. The conclusion is definitely very interesting, because he's very mad. You can tell he's really pissed, to put it lightly. He's like, I'm obviously forced to wrap this up quicker than I want to, essentially. And he's talking more about Gothic novels. And let's see. He's kind of recapping a little bit of this stuff. And then he says it would be foolish to describe either of the outstanding modern examples as each stream as Gothic novels, but they do contain many of the refined elements of the earlier type. They are both trilogies by British writers, namely Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Peake's Titus Groan books, which is funny. That is like the nicest thing I think I've ever heard Moorcock mention about Tolkien. It's kind of contradicted, though, later on. Anyways, he says they use this child thing, literally child in Titus Groan, childlike, hobbits in the Lord of the Rings. And then he says Peake's novels are far superior to Tolkien's, of course, because Peake's emphasis is on character, and he also says something that Peake's characters actually develop as the story goes on, while Tolkien's characters do not. I disagree. I don't think that's true, personally. But that's much nicer, I feel like, in some ways, than he is in Epic Pooh. So he goes back and he kind of mentions, let's see, he mentions Clara Reeves, the Old English Baron, a story which yearned for an age of chivalry that never was and was influenced by medieval romance. And so he'll mention, like, Idylls of the King is this kind of thing. And then we also have, like, the Waverley novels, which I would imagine Ivanhoe is probably Sir Walter Scott's most famous one. And then the historical writers who read those novels would later go on to, so like Harold Lamb is a big one, would go on to influence the sword and sorcery writers, who he says Lord Dunsany is the first. It's kind of interesting because there is a big argument on who is the first sword and sorcery writer. I know generally people would just say Robert E. Howard to keep it simple. I'm just going to stick with Robert E. Howard, but it's interesting. He says Lord Dunsany is recognizably the first, and he basically goes on to say, I haven't actually read much of this guy. I don't like him, essentially, because he's too archaic. And then he also says that archaic style is a problem with Tolkien as well, though Tolkien kind of makes up for it with his own merits. though he says Clark Ashton Smith doesn't have these bad problems that Dunsany has, which is a little interesting. He basically also says he doesn't like Conan, he doesn't like reading Robert E. Howard, but then, you know, he's a big fan of Fritz Leiber, and so he says Fritz Leiber is the next important contributor to the growing body of stories in the sword and sorcery vein. Originally in unknown and later in fantastic, he polished tales of Fafnir the Grey Mouser, owed influence to Howard, but harked back to Smith and their use of understatement and sardonic dialogue. His tales combine the best of both kinds and have a very distinct flavor, which I find most palatable. If Conan was the frontiersman, then the Grey Mouser is the sharp operator for me, a much more interesting and subtle character. And then he says, for some critics have said to the contrary, I am not a great sword and sorcery fan and find Howard and E.R. Barrows in particularly virtually unreadable. One of my criticisms of all Leiber is that the stuff is, like far too much science fiction and fantasy, emotionally unconvincing. So Leiber is convincing, but I guess most other stuff is not. But I think that sounds like he's criticizing most people, so don't take it too personally, Howard and Burroughs fans, because I'm a Howard and Burroughs fan too. He says he basically is kind of doing an early epic poo thing here. He's calling most of this stuff childish. He says, the writer who merely recaptures the dream worlds of childhood without adding to what his adult mind has learned is an inadequate artist, if nothing else. And he said, the label of emotional immaturity is an easy one to attach and is often applied these days, but I think it will stick in this case. This may be the reason why the appeal of sword and sorcery is on the whole to the younger readers whose emotions are understandably not yet fully matured. Okay, anyways, and then the good sword and sorcery story should have something of the function of a moving belt, perhaps carrying the reader with it. The dream worlds of those stories are worlds to which writer and reader initially escape. They leave everything behind. The dream landscapes and structures the less limited writer discovers are, as he creates a story, will soon be utilized for his own artistic purposes, if he has any. He will cease to be merely an escapist entertainer. He will apply his skill and understanding to make these worlds relevant to our own situation. He goes back and says, Peake does a good job of this, Leiber does a good job of this, and I've tried to do a good job of this with Elric. And he says, if you want a good current developments in fantasy, read Titus Grown by Peake, Two-Sought Adventure by Leiber, which I have a copy up there now. This is before the Ace paperback, so you would want to start with Swords and Deviltry or Swords Against Death these days. The Drowned World by Ballard, I've never read it. The Naked Lunch trilogy by William Burroughs, I've also never read it. And then, okay, he goes on to insult science fiction a ridiculous amount. And then it's funny because you often hear this as the reason for science fiction as opposed to fantasy, which, most people will label these speculative fiction today. I will say they are essentially very similar or the same. It says, if science fiction's purpose is, as some say, to prepare people for possible eventualities in the future by detailing the probable influence that our technical progress will have on new generations, then it has largely failed. On the whole, I regard this claim as unsubstantiated. Much as I enjoy reading science fiction, I enjoy it for its moods, images, and the fresh moods and images which they in turn create in me. The limitations of science fiction nowadays are far greater than its possibilities. Today, the better science fiction stories are largely defeated by being science fiction. On the whole, science fiction themes are super conventionally handled, and this results in the ruin and conventionalization of whatever merit existed in the theme originally. Where else, for instance, would a story like Harry Harrison's The Streets of Ashkelon be hailed as daringly unconventional, save in the super conventional world of science fiction? With all due respect to writer and editor, this theme has been used in mainstream fiction in one way or another for years. The fact is, of course, that the best science fiction is not strictly science fiction. The themes of A Case of Conscience, A Canticle for Leibowitz, or The Streets of Ashkelon, if handled well, would carry infinitely more impact if you put it in a present-day setting. Science fiction readers, writers, and editors comprise, it appears, one of the most shockable sections of the modern reading public. Anyways, I think that's hilarious. And I'm not sure I agree with him 100% either. It's just kind of funny. You have to realize that this is in the 60s, and this is like right around the time, you can kind of get hints of it from quotes I've said from this, right around the time fantasy is becoming more popular than science fiction. And this would continue into the 70s, where I would say fantasy is more popular than science fiction. And the sword and sorcery dies essentially at the end of the 70s, and then you get the rise of epic fantasy, other types of heroic fantasy in the 80s, until you get a lot of modern fantasy starting in the 90s, or late 80s in some cases. And even late 70s is really where it starts with like sort of Shannara. In the late 80s, you'll get Memory Star and Thorn, and then, Wheel of Time in the 90s and stuff like that. I would love if you wrote this essay today, just so you can tear those apart too. Anyways, whether I like the series or not. Man, wow, okay. But he basically goes on to say science fiction couldn't survive on its own, right? And so sci-fi was dominant. It was more popular than fantasy, basically from the 40s Campbellian Revolution up until this point. And I disagree. Science fiction has survived, right? Less connected to fantasy, as it has been in recent decades. So anyways, and he says, as a potential form, then the sword and sorcery story is the better bet as a vehicle for unconventional ideas. In some ways, I kind of agree with him actually on that, but I don't know, better is maybe the right word there. He goes on to say this, it is, if a writer is any damn good, he doesn't need a gimmicky vehicle to carry his ideas. So basically he's saying science fiction is a bad vehicle, but he doesn't need the vehicle essentially if the writer's good enough. And then he also goes on to say the term speculative fantasy, I would say we say speculative fiction these days. Fiction, fantasy, what the hell's the difference in that word? There isn't really one. He doesn't say that, that's my opinion. And so speculative fantasy is what he's calling it here. That's what Ballard calls it. I would say that's what we call speculative fiction these days. And of course horror is just fantasy anyways. Until you get the slasher stuff, which I would say doesn't really get popular until the 80s, and so maybe that's why he doesn't mention it here. I think he would hate on that too. Okay, and so he mentions some people he likes, like Aldous and Ballard, and he says that they're illiterate. No wonder they stand out. And so, yeah, anyways, harsh words. He says, in the field of magazines, there have been two which have acted as outlets for the changeover story. One in America, one in Britain. The British magazine is science fantasy. The American is fantastic. After this issue, we shall be left with one. Obviously very bitter about science fantasy's state at that time, which, it was sad. Woe is him. And it says, it was not only my opinion that science fantasy was achieving a more literary and less prosaic tone in its choice of material. To some extent, it has always possessed a more literary image than any of its competitors. In recent years, with publication of stories like The Watchtowers, Where is the Bird of Fire, Same Time, Same Place, Skeleton Crews, and many others, it has shown the uses to which fantasy can be put, has done something more than entertain on an escapist level. Perhaps this is why it was beginning to be thought, in this country and in the States, the best of all the current magazines. It has long been a maxim that the best doesn't sell as well as the worst. Ironically, future analysis may show that science fantasy's very death was due to its emphasis on literate and literary writing rather than on gadgets and gimmicks. Oof, okay, and that's it. Those are the last words. So this went longer than I had hoped, but about what I expected, to be honest. So my calendar still says December. It is New Year's for me for about another hour. So if you made it till the end, let me know your thoughts. If I can, I'll try to find a version of this online so I can publish it down below. If there isn't one there that I might have forgotten, so remind me, someone in the comments, if you do want to read it. But again, you could always potentially read it in Exploring Fantasy Worlds, this collection. Again, edited by Daryl Schweitzer. And anyways, it's been Liam Lyceum. This was really fun. This is probably actually the most fun I've had on any of these essay videos, that is. And there's been some really good ones, so quite exciting. Anyways, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to my rambles on a little Michael Moorcock essay by the name of Aspects of Fantasy. I'll catch you next time.